Okay, so I'd like to make everyone welcome to this, which is the final seminar in this series on sustainability politics. Or we could see it as the penultimate seminar if we include a mini conference on the political economy of hydrogen that will be held next month, also in webinar form. Now, a common thread to the seminars we've held in this series this year are focus on environmental crisis, on its urgency, on what can be done, and on what obstacles have been preventing effective action. And a common to all of the seminars has been some concern with questions of technology too, often in very different ways. Here in the audience, we have David Hughes, who launched his book on Who Owns the Wind, which has an interestingly ambivalent approach to technology, but broadly is, supporting a massive rollout of wind farms around the world. From a rather different perspective, we heard from Alf Hornborg with his ideas on technology fetishism, suggesting that technology being presented as kind of magic bullet has a fetish quality that tends to prevent effective climate action. Today we have Wim Carton speaking to us from Lund University, and he is looking into he has been doing some fascinating research on direct air capture of carbon, so carbon removal through direct air capture. There's a wonderful essay he has written together with Andreas Malm that appeared last year, I think, and is available open access, which is called Seize the Means of Carbon Removal: The Political Economy of Direct Air Capture. And here today, he'll be speaking on direct air capture, and for about 25 to 30 minutes. And following that, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you very much for sparing time to be with us, Wim, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Gareth. So let's see, share screen. You can all see this. So I'm going to talk about direct air capture, and I'm going to give a pretty kind of broad level analysis of what I think are the main kind of trends and questions in it that touch on the kind of general politics of direct air capture and carbon removal more broadly. This is because this is kind of an ongoing research topic for me, and I can talk a lot about these things in more detail, and I try not to do so because I'll get carried away. So maybe Garrett, you'll have to restrain me in terms of time. But so I'm really happy to take questions and go into details in some of the discussion afterwards. So yeah, I can explain a little bit more about what I'm doing at the moment while we walk through this. So I want to start by basically positioning this in terms of the latest IPCC report. So as you all know, what was it, last week, 2 weeks ago, the Working Group 3 report of the latest IPCC assessment report came out. And one of the points in that report is this statement on carbon removal, right? Which basically says that the deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. And this, of course, continues on from a long-standing trend now in a number of IPCC assessment reports where carbon removal have played an increasingly important role. And there's a whole lot to unpack just in the depiction of these technologies in the models itself that I'm not going to go into at the moment. But I mean, it's important to know that these things I think should be taken with quite a bit of skepticism and a mountain of salt, if you will. And there's a lot of critique of, the way that the models have arrived at this, from various disciplines. So that's a topic in itself. It's just important that this is widely contested. What isn't widely contested, I think, and that is mostly to do, I think, with the scales of this, right? Because sometimes we see in some of these scenarios that the IPCC is bringing together, we see enormous amounts of carbon dioxide removal, basically. A general consensus, I would say, is that there will be some degree of carbon removal, just, I mean, at a basic level, just because, the global carbon cycle is a process of balancing emissions and removals, right? So if you just bring it down to how, harvesting from land use works, then there's always some removals in that. But between that and some of the more extreme scenarios, there's an enormous spread. And the reason why the IPCC says this can be kind of summarized with this graph. And I know it's a bit of a kind of, as most graphs in the IPCC reports are, it's a bit difficult to read. But basically what I want to point to is just this general trend here, this dotted line, right, that takes us to a point here somewhere 2055 to 0, and then below. And this line represents net zero emissions. So what it basically shows is this idea that is fundamental to this notion that CO2 carbon removal is unavoidable, is that we've left it so late with emission reductions that we cannot reduce them fast enough anymore to stay within 1.5 degrees. But we will also need to rely on these gross CO2 removals that are here to the right, so everything below the 0 line here, to compensate for some of those emissions that will remain after 1.5 degree by the middle of the century. And so the IPCC breaks this down into 3 distinct kind of rationales for carbon removal in these scenarios. One is this notion of we can use carbon removal before we reach net zero to speed up or increase the ambition of climate action. We can compensate for continued so-called residual emissions at the point of net zero by balancing them with some removals. And then we can also use removals to reach a point where we basically have more carbon coming out of the atmosphere than we're putting in, which means that we could potentially reduce temperatures again. So all this really says, actually, and I don't, I think the distinction isn't, I think, as important as they make it out to be, is that, we go from a situation where removals are less than continued emissions to where they equal continued emissions to where they ultimately here with net negative exceed continued emissions. So can we remove carbon from the atmosphere? And the answer is, there's a lot of potential methods to do so. And this is the first time in the IPCC report that these methods are being assessed in terms of their risks, their potentials, the various trade-offs, and so on, beyond what the scenarios themselves say. Again, this is a kind of graph. There's a lot going on there, but the main important thing here is just to say that there's really quite a bit of work going on with all kinds of proposals of how this might happen, going from the kind of more land-based biological approaches, the things we know as tree planting and everything related to that, to kind of the more ocean stuff, and then the kind of more chemical methods of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, which is where we come to direct air capture. So the point being here that this is the first time that the IPCC report talks about direct air capture, and that is because previous reports mainly talks about this technology called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which essentially is just you put carbon capture and storage on a biomass plant, and that allows you to suck CO2 of the atmosphere because, of course, planting trees and all kinds of other vegetation through photosynthesis sequesters carbon, and then if you burn that carbon but you capture the CO2, then essentially you could create something of a negative emission pump. The other technology that has been in the IPCC report so far is this as afforestation, right? A kind of more natural land use change. And this is the first time, as I said, that direct air capture is in there. And the reason that we are seeing, and the reason I'm talking about direct air capture here today, and that we are seeing so much interest in direct air capture is because of this high-level concerns about the role of both BECCS and afforestation. And that's to do with the trade-offs here, right? So this is another graph by the IPCC, and I just show here that there's been a lot of kind of concerns about especially the negative impacts of both afforestation and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage on other land use, other demands on land and land use, both in terms of food supply, but also biodiversity. At the scales at which some of these things are being imagined, this would inevitably lead to pretty dire consequences. So enter direct air capture as a little bit of a savior technology that promises, at least if you believe the narrative on this, that promises to kind of resolve this tension, right? Because as opposed to these kind of technologies that rely on biological sequestration, direct air capture is a technology that uses chemicals to capture CO2 directly from the air, and therefore does not have this kind of land use component. At least not in the same sense. If you count in the kind of energy requirements, it's a bit of a different story, but at least you don't need to kind of, there's no immediate trade-off with food production, for example, or natural forest. And this, by the way, is the currently only, it's maybe not, there's a few pilots, but this is at least the largest direct air capture facility currently operating that sequestered CO2 permanently. This is in Iceland, attached to a geothermal plant by a company called Climeworks. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But so basically, just very briefly, we're talking about a technology where essentially you have a fan, you suck ambient air through that fan into a filter that contains some kind of a chemical. Could be with Climeworks, it's a solid sorbent that basically captures CO2 and lets the rest of the air out again. And then what you do is you close it off, you heat up the filter that releases the CO2, you capture the CO2, and then you could essentially pump it underground and in that way put it away permanently. And Iceland, they mix it with water and then it mineralizes in reaction with the basalt that is in the geological formation there. So it is actually a permanent way of sequestering CO2 from a purely technological perspective. Now, the mind-blowing thing about this whole discourse about direct air capture is just the, I mean, in terms of, this is a gold mine if you want to do like a narrative discourse analysis, or, you know, I mean, there's just so much going on in terms of claims being made here and the kind of scale at which this is going to pan out. So this alone, right, is the scale-up roadmap of this one company, Climeworks, where they basically estimate that they are going to go from the 4,000-ton facility that they currently have to a 50,000-ton facility next year to a 500,000-ton facility by 2025. So, I mean, there's a really kind of bold ambitions being put forward here, and probably you would need to be even bolder to be in line with some of the expectations that are put on this technology in some of these models. And you have to give it to them. There's a lot of money pouring into this company at the moment, but it's certainly fascinating to follow. Climeworks is certainly not the only one. There's a company, Canadian company called Carbon Engineering, that are planning to start building a, don't remember if it's a 500,000 ton or a 1 million ton facility in the Permian Basin in Texas. So this is just a rendering of it, but they're very much planning to do so. They have the funding in place and stuff. And I'll talk a little bit about this in more detail later because there's a lot happening there. And there's, you know, global thermostat. There's I mean, these things are popping up like mushrooms, I would say. There's a lot of startups that are trying to do the same thing. The main point here being that, you know, the kind of narrative of this is that, you know, we need to permanently sequester carbon, and this is kind of what it looks like, right? We have ideally a renewable energy source that powers these giant machines that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. We separate the CO2 and we pump it underground, and it will stay there forever. That's kind of the ideal narrative. The point being, of course, that what is actually happening on the ground looks quite different from this ideal narrative. And this is where we need to talk about the political economy of actually existing direct air capture. And so some of the work I'm doing at the moment is really trying to delve into some of the claims that are being made about some of these things. So first of all, I think it's really interesting to note that you know, we should ask the question, whose climate solution is this actually? It's a technology that is really exceedingly popular with kind of big tech and with a specific kind of billionaire class. So Bill Gates, Murray Edwards is a billionaire that made his money through tar sands. We're early investors in carbon engineering, for example. Bill Gates and Microsoft are major investors in Climeworks at the moment as well. I know Bill Gates is offsetting some of his personal emissions through some of these companies. Elon Musk, or everybody's favorite billionaire at the moment. I just can't get enough of this picture. I mean, it's just like the heroism that shines. Somebody should, I don't know. But Elon Musk funded 100 million into the X Prize on carbon removal, and they just announced the winners. So there's going to be a number of companies that are going to share 100 million to scale carbon removal, and I haven't counted them, but almost the majority, almost half, I think, are direct air capture companies or related to it. Of course, this is very much in line with all the other things that Musk wants to do. The other dimension to this is, of course, the kind of entanglements between direct air capture and some of the kind of vested interest in the fossil fuel industry. And I don't want to overstate this in the sense that, you know, the fossil fuel industry's main narrative on, you know, how to go about climate change very much is still focused somewhere else. And you're going to talk about hydrogen later. I think hydrogen seems like a much more hype technology through some of these fossil fuel companies than direct air capture is at the moment. But it's definitely there in some of the examples that I'm going to mention. And the reason for this is, of course, quite obvious, I think, in that, you know, direct air capture is a technology that basically promises, a bit like CCS, right, to kind of decouple the ambition to mitigate climate change and actually, you know, not just as with solar geoengineering mask climate change, but actually do something about CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, decouple that from the need to phase out fossil fuels. And that's, of course, one would assume an appealing prospect. So it's a potential spatio-temporal fix for some of these companies. I have two examples here. One is this announcement just recently by Occidental. So Occidental, oil and gas company in the US, they've basically been the main drivers behind this facility that I talked about earlier by carbon engineering that they're going to build in the Permian Basin. Together with a venture capitalist firm, they've gone together and basically they're going to fund this, they're going to build this plant, and it's going to be used mainly for enhanced oil recovery. So meaning that they're going to pump CO2, the CO2 that they capture down, and then they're going to use that to increase the productivity of the oil wells that they have so they can squeeze out a bit more oil. And CO2 has long been used, especially in the US, for enhanced oil recovery, of course. So this is just a way of kind of increasing the, I guess, updating the narrative on this in line with ongoing you know, climate ambitions and demand for climate action. And again, right, if somebody wants to delve into this, there's also a gold mine here in terms of claims of carbon neutral oil and even carbon negative oil and all of these kind of things that you could somehow achieve by using direct air capture for enhanced oil recovery. So, but the point being here that Occidental, has planned now to build not just one, but 70 of these plants to capture 1 million tons of CO2 from the air by 2035. That would mean that Occidental basically is kind of the main driver of scaling this at the moment. Another example comes from Saudi Aramco, who are kind of moving in this direction as well. I haven't looked at the actual investments that they've been making, but on their website, they're really pushing this narrative, the circular carbon economy. And it's kind of a repurposing of the circular economy notion, but for carbon, where you could essentially use direct air capture to suck CO2 of the atmosphere. And then you use that for enhanced oil recovery. You push out the oil, you use the oil, and then it's emitted, but because you have direct air capture, you can capture the carbon again and continue through the whole process. So it's basically a way of entering fossil fuel extraction into the kind of global carbon cycle. That's fundamentally what is going on here. So they say, we believe the circular carbon economy is the best framework for achieving the greatest impact in reducing global emissions while ensuring consistent economic growth. And indeed, why would they say anything else? So we see a number of these examples, right? I mean, there's Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil have all made minor investments in some of these startups. Of course, they're investing in some other forms of carbon removal as well. Shell in particular, Total in natural climate solutions for offset. So, I mean, there's a lot more going on here than just this, but it's definitely part of it. Another aspect of this is that we have this ideal vision of direct air capture, but we're increasingly seeing that the actual governance of this and the actual political economy of this looks very, very neoliberal, in line with, of course, what we have seen for climate environmental regulation in the last decades, right? So there's this notion that direct air capture is kind of the next frontier for the voluntary carbon market, for example, where this is where permanent removals are going to come from. And this is essentially, how we're going to be able to scale this market in the absence of government funding. And this is essentially, I think, the narrative out there at the moment, is that most people recognize that, it would be ideal to have some kind of subsidy by governments for doing this, but in the absence of this, we'll have to rely on offsets, kind of. So Climeworks, for example, Carbon Engineering, all have a subscription scheme on their websites where you could basically, remove your travel emissions, for example, or eliminate your carbon footprint or these kind of things. So it's at the moment really kind of an offsetting scheme, either at an individual or at a corporate level. And we see that, I think, the vision of this is really being pushed by big tech as well. So we just recently, there was a almost 1 billion advanced market commitment made for permanent carbon removal tech, of which direct air capture is kind of a main component, by Alphabet, which is Google, right? Meta, which is Facebook, Shopify and Stripe, which are these kind of major financial transaction and I don't even know how you would depict Shopify, but they're major players in the kind of tech scene. So their vision of this is that they will basically buy whatever direct air capture comes onto the market at whatever price that it takes, up to this 1 billion. And they say that this is a way to help scale this market. It's a way to commercialize direct air capture, essentially. The point I want to make here, and this is why this idea of whose emissions are unavoidable is listed here, is that to me the interesting aspect of this is that there's a claim being made on we need these technologies because some of the emissions that we currently have we will not be able to reduce. They are residual, they're hard to abate, it's not possible to get rid of them. and therefore we need direct air capture. And of course, allocating these things through the market essentially leaves it up to the market to decide whose emissions are unavoidable. So it's the likes of, Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and essentially you get a kind of appropriation by the rich of the kind of limited unavoidable emission budget that we might conceivably, in a kind of narrow sense, allow. This budget is being kind of consumed by the people who can basically afford this, and is being allocated through a market. And this is some of the work that I'm currently doing in terms of kind of trying to unpack these notions of unavoidability and what's going on there, and who's making these claims, and what that actually is based on, right? Because often these kind of conflate technological impossibility with economic cost ineffectiveness, basically, or just political inconvenience. There's like a very fuzzy border between these two things, right? So essentially at the moment, especially if you allocate it through markets, any company can claim any emissions that they like as hard to abate or unavoidable. And there's a major opportunity for greenwashing in this, of course. A final point with the political economy of actual existing direct air capture is that, there's this vision of permanent carbon removal, but of course, there's no exchange value to be gained from permanently sequestering carbon removal if you don't get an offset, right? And that's, we've seen the problems with the offsetting market in the past. That's not a given that you'll be able to do that at a massive scale beyond these kind of few luminaries that are willing to put up the massive amounts of funding that it takes at the moment to do this. So there's a massive appeal at the moment to instead capture that CO2 and do something else with it. Basically turn it into exchange value. I already talked about enhanced oil recovery. That's of course one of the clearest examples where actually the claim is that one could both turn it into a commodity and have at least some degree of permanent removal, because the idea would be that some CO2 does stay down. But there's all kinds of other visions as well, right? And again, there's so many startups here that just the aesthetics of it are extremely fascinating. So there's Prometheus Fuels, for example, which I just use as an example for this notion that we could use the CO2, we could capture the CO2, and then basically you combine it with hydrogen, which you can get from electrolysis. And basically what you have is a hydrocarbon that you could burn in any kind of combustion engine that you have at the moment, with de facto zero air pollution. And that this is kind of, what we could do instead of electrifying everything. We could just make synthetic fuels. And this company is trying to do this for just gasoline to use in cars. But the main narrative about this definitely is about aviation and shipping fuels, right? That this is a way to kind of decarbonize the aviation industry by making synthetic fuels based on CO2 from direct air capture. There's all kinds of other commodities as well, right? I mean, there's startups trying to make vodka out of CO2 captured from the air, or shoes, or any kind of commodity that you can think of. Diamonds. I mean, you just think about it, and probably somebody's trying to do it. How am I doing for time, Garrett?
Maybe another 5 or 10 at most minutes would be good.
Okay, good. Now I stop my screen sharing. Let me just, yeah, I don't think I need more than that. Sorry. It's just that I can't see the time when I'm in the screen share, so that's why. All right, so the question I want to arrive at here then is, what room is there actually for direct air capture in progressive climate politics? This is a kind of question that I'm asking, and it's the question I'm asking because there's a major debate about this, I think, among progressives, among people who really care about climate action. So it's not, just the fossil fuel industry that is piling in this, or that is creating narratives about this. There's a lot of different actors that are putting a lot of hope in direct air capture. or carbon removal more generally, and hope in the idea that, yes, there's all kinds of forms in which vested interests are kind of mobilizing this to justify business as usual, but one could imagine more progressive and alternative ways of doing this. So there's a massive debate on this at the moment, I think. So I just want to run us through some of the options here. So I think it's pretty clear that currently the picture of the actual existing political economy, direct air capture, and where we're heading is quite dystopian if you care about, not putting all the power of climate action into the hands of Elon Musk, and if you don't want to delay and provide fixes for vested interest and excuses to keep extracting oil and gas. But could we invent, or could we imagine something better? Is it a case that we need to reject direct air capture, or can we actually try and reform it? So I think ultimately this pivots around the question of to what extent do we actually need direct air capture? So it's worth coming back to, I think, the notion that is put forward at the beginning in this graph of the different reasons for the supposed necessity or unavoidability of direct air capture. So essentially the narrative is there's the IPCC in that graph put two of them, right? I think we could conflate them to two, but they put forward three, and I think we can put them together in two. So one is this idea that there are some emissions that we simply cannot get rid of completely, either because of technological reasons or because of political or economic reasons, but there will be some emissions that will still be there, and then we need a technology to basically balance those emissions out to get to net zero by removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's this idea that permanent forms of CDR will be necessary to compensate for residual emissions. The other use of CDR that is put forward is to bring temperatures back down after we have exceeded our desired temperature target. Now, the models sometimes bet on this, which is an extremely risky thing to do, and that's not what I'm promoting here. What I'm promoting, or I'm not promoting anything, what I'm basically arguing is that the option here is that carbon removal, at least theoretically, can help us reduce temperatures again. So that's the second use of it can deal with kind of historical legacy emissions, if you will. That's the second use of CDR, of permanent CDR, such as direct air capture. And all of this kind of pivots around the kind of ways in which we kind of frame or what one could call the kind of politics of possibility, right? The disagreements on how fast different groups in society, different interest groups think that we could decarbonize. What is seen as possible and impossible? So if you think that you could speed up way beyond what some of the scenarios in the IPCC report says, then one could definitely make an argument that there's not all of that much need for CDR. And I think there's good reasons why we should see the scenarios as quite conservative. But my point here is there's really no real easy answers here. It is about like how it's a fundamentally ideological question, I think. So to come to these 2 points, first of all, the notion that we need to compensate for residual emissions, I think is problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's clear that if we can't rely on like some kind of objective idea of what is possible or not possible, right? But it's clearly desirable to phase out fossil fuels. There's technological alternatives for many of the things that are often claimed as residual emissions, not all of it, but certainly many of it. So I think there's an argument there for why residual emissions could be far less than what is often claimed. One might imagine direct air capture as a way for synthetic fuels, maybe in some sectors, if there is no alternatives, but that would not be forms of permanent removal, but that would be a way of decarbonizing them without relying on removals, but it would still involve the same technology, of course. Another issue here is that if you rely on direct air capture to compensate for residual emissions, essentially what happens is that there's a trade-off between how you use, because direct air capture, especially at the moment, requires a massive amount of energy. And some of the scenarios that, or some of the studies that have been run on this It's often a ridiculous amount, up to like 25% of total global energy supply in 2100 or something ridiculous like that. So it's extremely energy intensive, at least at the moment. So there's a trade-off there, of course, with how you use those renewables that you would need to fuel those plants, because there's of course no point in fueling them with fossil fuels. Do you replace fossil fuels directly, or do you use them for direct air capture? And I think that's a really strong reason for minimizing direct air capture, right? So we don't divert resources and renewables with all the problems we already have of scaling them up from actually taking offline coal power plants and everything else. I think most convincing argument in the literature on residual emissions is about agriculture. And this is ultimately, I think, something that is hard to, there's always going to be some emissions associated with agriculture, just by virtue of the fact that we harvest things, that CO2 that is removed from the land, you need to kind of rebalance that, right? So there are going to be residual emissions, but if you restrict residual emissions to the land use sector, then you can also balance them with biological removals. In fact, it would make most sense to do that, because essentially what it would mean is that you would move towards a circular agricultural system, and there's a lot of other good reasons for doing that beyond pure climate change mitigation. So I would say residual emissions in itself are not a convincing reason for supporting large-scale direct air capture. In fact, they're a pretty risky reason for it, especially if you take into account all the kind of moral hazard questions. Then there's the question of overshoot, and I'm coming to the end of my talk here, Gareth. I'll round up. So as I said, it's extremely risky to bet on overshoot, as some of the scenarios do, mainly because we can we can reduce temperatures again, but there's many climate impacts, of course, that are not reversible. And that's why, again, there's a lot of kind of interesting discourses happening about, direct air capture is kind of promising to reverse climate change. And of course, that's an extreme simplification of what the technology could do. You will not be able to reverse, species that have gone extinct, or any kind of long-term changes to the cryosphere, to glaciers and the ice caps. There's all kinds of things that are not reversible, of course, when it comes to climate impact. But temperatures in itself, potentially, if you don't take a too pessimistic view on climate feedback mechanisms, might potentially be reversible. So the question then to me is, if we could actually reverse some temperature increases, even if it involves trade-offs in terms of energy and resource use, should we do it? Because obviously here, biological carbon removal will not be enough. Any carbon that you remove in the land use sector is just a way of recapturing carbon that was released from the land use sector in the first place. It's a limited sink. So to get rid of the fossil fuel emissions or fossil fuel CO2 in the atmosphere, you would need to do something else. And there is no way to do that with conventional mitigation technologies, of course. And this is, I think, the one promise of kind of more technological removals that is kind of hard to get around. And I'm not saying this is kind of a solid argument for doing it. We're very far away from being able to reverse temperatures. We need to get to zero first. But this is, in my view, why it's difficult to dismiss direct air capture completely, because it does potentially offer things that would be desirable, maybe from a justice or a progressive climate action perspective, that are not possible with other technologies. So to sum up, direct air capture particularly compatible with fossil fuel heavy mitigation pathways, at least in theory. There's a lot of ways in which that, of course, builds on very problematic assumptions of scalability and funding and all of these kind of things. The current political economy of direct air capture points to a tension with permanent removal, capture by vested interests, and all kinds of injustices and resource trade-offs. As I said, whose emissions are actually unavoidable. So can direct air capture be part of progressive climate politics? I think it shouldn't be part of an effort to compensate for residual emissions. I think that's a weak reason for supporting large-scale removals. But one could definitely see ways in which it could help do things like remove legacy emissions, and that could be something that we want to consider at a certain point. I think I'm going to end there. And yes, there's obviously no way in which that will happen within the way that this is currently being promoted, right? This would require an entirely different political economic approach to direct air capture. So it's a very utopian vision, and one could talk about, the validity or the risks of even talking about that, right? And lending legitimacy then to something that is, being co-opted by vested interests. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wim, for this fascinating talk, which I guess could be described as an extremely carefully hedged pitch for direct air capture, where much of the talk was spent on the hedging. Really interesting, and it raises a host of questions. Everyone here, whether a Brunel colleague or a guest from outside, is very welcome to pitch in with questions. I had a couple lined up on the energy trade-offs and on whether you looked into Climeworks accounts. You've been doing a lot of research there. I wonder if they shared their accounts with you, because you talk of a lot of money pouring in. I was wondering where that money is coming from, presumably not states, presumably something like, I would guess, airlines looking for offsetting ideas. But I'm not going to ask any questions, actually, because we already have so many hands up. So I'll take them in the order they've appeared. Wim, would you mind if we take maybe 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then you can come back on a bunch?
Yeah, no, sure. Anna, sorry, I realized I went a bit over time there, but
no, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. I can. We can.
It was a perfect length of talk. It was great. Okay, let's start with the 2 Davids first. Camfield.
Thanks. So my question is about the use of direct air capture on a large scale obviously raises the question about the energy source that would actually enable this. And I'm just wondering how you would square this with, if from a climate justice perspective, we want to be driving towards zero emissions and within the advanced capitalist countries, reducing energy demand in order to facilitate the greater use of energy and simultaneously decarbonization in the global south. How does this square with any potential use of large-scale direct air capture?
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And David Hughes?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gareth and Wim. I have a very short question with a long comment around it. The short question is, what's a better word than overshoot? The long comment is that I think that's the issue. If you're talking, Wim, about how progressives should think about this, I don't think we should focus on the technology of direct air capture. I think we should focus on the larger context, which is this question of overshoot. I think that's the wrong word. That's, of course, industry's word. It suggests something easily corrected, like you're shooting at targets and you have 3 arrows and you place the first one above the bullseye and the second one below the bullseye, and then you get it on the third one. It actually trivializes what's at stake here. And what's at stake here seems to be breaking the promise of 1.5 or even 2.0. And you point out very accurately that you can't necessarily correct by breaking that promise because there are the biophysical feedback loops and so on. There's also a political problem or a social problem, because if we break that threshold, presumably we get into a situation of societal breakdown, of environmental refugees on the scale of hundreds of millions, and violence and so on, and elites, corporations, governments and so on will be consumed with those problems, which might actually be very fossil fuel intensive. If people are drowning in the ocean, I want a dispatchable diesel engine to help rescue them. So in any case, the point is that we established this benchmark of 1.5 on the principle that life breaks down past that threshold. So obviously, it's not logical to say, well, we'll exceed that threshold, and then in all these legal, rational, sensible ways, we'll pull back, because civilization will have entered some kind of apocalypse at that point. So what's a better way of describing all of that, a more political way of describing all of that than calling it overshoot?
Yeah, no, those are great points. And maybe on the last question first. I mean, I used overshoot because that's the way it's framed in the IPCC reports and in the kind of modeling literature. And that is very much meant as you say, right, this kind of temporary moment where, we first exceed 1.5 degrees, and then we, by 2100, we still stay below it. And that's definitely not something desirable, as you say, because of all of those reasons. There's a lot of people talking about this, I think, in terms of climate restoration, for example, that gets more at what is at stake, right? It's a moment at which we want to consider whether we want to pursue an effort to reduce global temperatures rather than just stabilize them, which is just what we're currently talking about. Now, the problem with that, I think, is that I'm not sure I actually agree that 1.5 or 2 degrees is kind of a breaking point, right? Where all of a sudden we, this is where things break down. This is where we see some kind of collapse moment. I've been thinking a bit about, like, I mean, it's a poor analogy because we're very far away from even reaching zero at the moment, right? But what would it take for governments at this moment to commit to reducing temperatures again to 1 degree, for example? We're at 1.2 warming at the moment. I think it would take quite a lot, because I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that obviously climate change is not a homogeneous, it doesn't impact people homogeneous. Life is already breaking down for some people somewhere, right? And it will continue to do so. And my kind of dystopian vision of how this will happen is probably that, by 1.5 degrees, we'll have an increasingly dire situation in some parts of the world, and an increasing attempt to isolate ourselves, or the elites, elites will isolate themselves in the global north to the extent possible. And you have some kind of shifting baseline kind of syndrome as well, where we basically, the kind of, environmentally degraded world in which we live becomes kind of the new normal to a certain extent, at least, which is, I think, very much what we've seen. So I'm not even convinced that people will want to reduce temperatures unless we see, like, I mean, really dramatic climate change. And obviously we're talking about 1.5 degree now, not 3 degrees, where, I mean, things look very different. But so the short point here being that I think the way that this is being framed by, I mean, climate justice groups, for example, or some of these people working on carbon removal from a more progressive point of view, they talk about climate restoration, I think, and not about overshoot. And I think that probably captures this in a bit more of a just aware and a non-temporary and non-simplistic approach. Now, on energy source, so you're right? I mean, this is kind of the main dilemma with this, and irrespective of how you think about it, it would require an enormous amount of energy, and obviously it's hard to see where that would come from. So you would need to see a world where either you have significantly more electricity than we have today, or we are, I guess, in some of the literature, the thing that is being put forward is this notion that we could use direct air capture, for example, to use some of the intermittent peaks with renewable energy. So imagine that we have a lot of wind power, or we had a lot of solar power, and at some points, we will be producing much more than we can consume. Then we could use those peaks to run something like that, air capture. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other, probably better things you could do with those peaks, including, trying to store it somewhere. but that's kind of the narrative that is being put forward. But I very much agree, right, that it's really hard to see how one would square this. But I think it doesn't take away the fundamental question, right? If there's an opportunity for reversing some temperature increases, should we not at least consider it? And then we should talk about, of course, these kind of trade-offs with electricity demand and so on. But it's definitely a tricky question.
Thanks, Wim. So Annalyn had her hand up, but she's out of the room now. So let's take two questions in order, from Trevor and then from Aaron.
Thank you very much. So my question is about the two categories of carbon dioxide removals that you considered. So one was sort of removing residual emissions, if you like, and the other was net negative. And most of the finance aspects of it you consider were really in relation to residual emissions. My question is, how would the finance be covered once you get into the phase of massive negative emissions? Because there'll be no individual who will be identifiable for those residual emissions. And presumably it will fall onto nation states to negotiate amongst themselves to take on the burden of the massive financial costs that are associated with it. How do you imagine that taking place in the context of, I guess, the post-2050 world?
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna just note it down. You're gonna, Aaron, you wanna ask your question first?
Sure, thanks, Wim. So yeah, I think my question was just on the notion of the interchangeability of carbon that's embedded at the heart of the idea of carbon dioxide removal technologies, and the assumption that, you know, all carbon is fungible and equivalent, and somehow, you know, what was previously a lump of coal is now going to be the same thing as, you know, the CO2 that we've liquefied and put underground, or storing in soils or in trees or whatever. And you know, just the whole conceptual apparatus that has to go into kind of reimagining, you know, the abstractness of that has to happen before we can actually realize it. And just how, from a maybe different perspectives, you know, clearly coal is different from a tree, and you know, the way that they behave in the world is very different. That the longevity of the carbon store is very different. You know, the risk of you know, a tree burning down could release all that CO2 back in the air, whereas, you know, the coal deep underground is fairly safe for millennia. So you know, is that being taken into account in terms of the kind of the risk assessments of these technologies, in terms of yeah, the assumption that they're kind of like for like is really not a valid comparison?
Certainly not at the moment, I would say. I mean, there's a lot of kind of efforts to come up with standards or you know, guidelines that kind of push in this direction. But I would say this is a massive problem, especially when it comes to, you know, all of this reliance on biological carbon sequestration to offset fossil fuel emissions. And as you say, right, there's like massive risks involved there, temporalities that, I mean, at least policy makers, most companies are really not taking into account. And the problem, I think, is even worse than that. I mean, if you look at, I mean, like, for example, this category of residual emissions is not just CO2, right? We're talking about nitrous oxide, we're talking about methane as well. So essentially what is being imagined is that, you know, we can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere to compensate for continued nitrous oxide emissions, for example, or, you know, continued methane emissions, which I don't think people have started to grapple with, actually, with the, you know, inherent infungibilities of that. So it's certainly not part of the conversation to the extent that it needs to be. And I think, I mean, I think there's a really strong argument to be made, to be honest, for, you know, just separating the entire climate policy discussion, because it really doesn't make sense to talk about land use and everything to do with fossil fuel and industry emissions in the same category. It makes a lot of sense to talk about net zero when you talk about the land use sector, because there's an inherent carbon cycle, a natural carbon cycle that we've kind of amplified through anthropogenic processes. So I would like to see, in my utopian world, a scenario where, we talk about net zero in the land use sector, and we talk about getting rid of fossil fuels and industry emissions, and that should be the ultimate ambition, I think. And now just lumping these together creates all of these opportunities for people to claim things that scientifically and, from any kind of accountability perspective really do not make sense at all. And yeah, the second point on residual emissions and how to finance them, it's a great point, and there's no, I think, solution to it. I mean, there's no obvious way to finance that except through public means at the moment, and that raises, of course, major questions in itself. I just don't see that happening currently. And now there's some proposals being made for things like carbon take-back obligations, where essentially anyone who continues to put CO2 into the atmosphere would have to commit to also taking out CO2 at the same time. It's essentially, and I think there's major problems with that, because it's essentially some kind of mandatory offset, right? But one could imagine, of course, that instead of mandating that you pull out 1 ton of CO2 for 1 ton that you put in, that you pull out 5 tons for every ton that you put in. I mean, so that would be a way of maybe incentivizing through a market. God forbid, we don't want to go there, but that could be a way of incentivizing net negative emission. But I think there's a lot of agreement that this will have to come from the state to scale it, because carbon offset markets are just not going to be. I mean, we've seen the carbon offset market operate, and it's not a pretty picture. So I think there's a lot of agreement that there's going to have to be significant state funding for this, if it ever will happen.
Thanks, Wim. We have a bit of time left for other questions. Annalene has her hand up, and then I'll add a question of my own after Annalene has spoken.
Take the baby and I listen to you in the meantime.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't have so much to say to that more than I fully agree. I mean, I fully agree. That's the main risk here. That this is. I like this notion of. I mean, this is exactly why this company calling itself Global Thermostat is so ironic, because it is really this kind of very mechanistic view of what the climate is, right? And it's and this notion of, and this is actually something I've been wanting to write about, this very kind of notion of gradual change and not being able to take into account any kind of disruptive changes in the climate system, or in a political or economic system in that sense. So I fully share that concern. I just can't shake myself from the thought that, should we dismiss the theoretical possibility that we could reverse some temperatures without, with all the risks and all the caveats, and recognizing that there might be ways that climate feedbacks prevent that, and recognizing that that is going to be a very limited way of dealing with climate change, because climate change is so much more than that. But still, it might be able to save lives maybe, or help prevent some ecosystem from. I don't know. I mean, I think the argument to me is not that easily dismissed just because we want to avoid. I think it's extremely difficult, and I don't know fully where I land on this, to be honest. But I agree with your concern. It's totally valid.
A question that sort of is very similar to Annalene's, but a slightly different angle, perhaps, which is that, what I love about your paper today, and the paper in its greater length that you wrote with Andreas, is that it really does look so searchingly into the dilemma of direct air capture. And you and Andreas, what I share with you is a sense that we're in a situation of extreme urgency and utter emergency. And so you have to look at everything, you have to throw everything possible at this problem. And direct air capture might be something that needs to be thrown at it. But my worry about the way you present it is that basically, as I suggested earlier, this is essentially a pitch for direct air capture, albeit with a great deal of very careful hedging and qualifications and riders. And but my worry is that something similar might happen to your argument as happened to, say, Holly Jean Buck's argument on carbon capture and removal, which is, you know, at one point in her argument, she was saying, look, I mean, the political economy of CCS is such that it's only going to be used for nefarious purposes and isn't actually going to be helpful in the current political economic order in meaningful ways. But in a sort of future socialist society, there would be a clear role for it. But what happens to her argument is that final passage gets increasingly forgotten, and it becomes, the left, the Marxists, the radicals, even they are making a case for this. And my worry is that this could happen to your argument too over direct air capture.
Yeah, no, and I fully recognize that. And I mean, I hope that my talk today is less of a pitch for direct air capture than because obviously, I mean, we just couldn't resist the seize the means of carbon removal title. That was like too tempting somehow. But I think that's definitely more the case with that piece, right? And I actually am more ambiguous on this point than I think that article represents, and I hope that my talk today was a bit more. But I mean, this is also why I want to spend definitely most of my time not making an argument for direct air capture, but unpacking the political economy of it and all the ways it's being captured by. So I certainly don't plan to make the climate restoration argument a big part of my future work. That's not where I want to go with this. But I do think, as you say, right, that we really need to throw everything at this. And I mean, there's you can question. Let's put it like this. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to be skeptical of large-scale conventional mitigation technologies as well, right? And the way that they are being captured by vested interest and all of the trade-offs with them. So, I mean, in that sense, of course, direct air capture does something different for vested interest than the wind industry or than wind power and so on. But still, I think there's an argument to be made for, we need to assess this on the basis of, political effects, economic effects, but also trade-offs and so on. And I think we need to take a look at it at least. And we need to take a very skeptical look at it. But I would agree with the ones that say that we need to throw everything at it, at least in the sense that we need to look at it. And then, yeah, no, I can only say that I agree. That my main focus in my coming work is definitely going to be on trying to unpack all of the ways this is being framed in completely simplistic and simplified ways. So.
Yeah, the capture of direct air capture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's. I think we've come to a natural end there and a fitting conclusion. So. Thank you so much to Wim for devoting your time to us and being with us today. Thank you. Thanks to all of you who attended. I'll put this discussion up on online as a video at some stage. If anybody contributed and doesn't want their contribution to be included, then let me know and I can edit it out. As I mentioned at the start, this was the final seminar in our sustainability politics series, although there's going to be a sort of coda, so to speak, in the form of a mini conference on 18th of May on the hydrogen economy, on hydrogen's role in the energy transition, with some great speakers coming, Mark Jacobson from Stanford and Franziska Müller from Hamburg, Jan Rosenau, and Tom Baxter looking at the British situation as well. So that's 18th of May. Okay, well, let's leave it there. Thanks, Wim, and see you soon.